Okay, so Sunday mornings through the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, back and forth. We're currently going through the Old Testament book of 2 Samuel. So if you have a Bible, would you join me where we left off last time? 2 Samuel chapter 18, and there's ushers coming down the aisles with Bibles. You could get their attention. I'm going to cover about a chapter, so I'd like you to follow along with me. If you don't want to use your mobile device, you could just grab a Bible from them, borrow it, or keep it. We even mark the place for you so you know where to go if you're not familiar with it. And you can keep the bookmark, too, in the Bible if you need it. So 2 Samuel 18, I'm going to start at verse 19. It's on the screen there. And then go to chapter 19, verse 8. It's a little confusing, but because the 9s and 8s are wild. But you get the idea, right? We're in chapter 18. And while you're making your way there, you know, some years ago, I did a little bit of competitive swimming. I wasn't that great, but I like to compete at different things. So I was kind of a competitive swimmer. And, you know, when you're a competitive swimmer, you train in a pool most of the time. And when you do, you're taught to stay in your lane. Because typically what happens is not only are you in between two lane lines, but you're also sharing that lane with a bunch of other people, right? And you kind of have to swim in a circle is what it is. And in this loop. And if you don't stay to the right, you can imagine what happens. You just crash into each other. And usually, it only takes one time for you to do that to where you get the picture and you stay over on your side, you know, to keep that from happening again. And I bring that up because this idea of staying in your lane applies to a lot of areas of life. You know, like if you're a married couple. You know, when you're married, you know, the husband has his role and the wife has her role. And you're supposed to be obedient to that calling upon your life. The same thing goes with our work life. You know, you guys that work out in our community, you know that you can't do everybody else's job. You're just supposed to do your job well, right? Be faithful with what you do. Likewise, things like, you know, the scriptures urge us to mind our own business. Right? Yeah, it's important to you know, focus on my part, right? Focus on your part, and then let the Lord work the rest of it out. And that's why I called this message "Stay in Your Lane," because this chapter actually features a couple of people who are having trouble staying in their lane, and maybe we could learn something from it. You know, people who are like, you know, they're supposed to do this, but I want to do this, right? And usually that gets people off track. And here's the main thing that usually gets people off track from staying where they're supposed to be is selfishness. You know, we just want more. Right? Not satisfied. And that's what happens here. These two main people in our scriptures want what's best for them primarily, not necessarily what's best for everybody else. And so as we go through this theme of stay in your lane, I'm going to break it into two parts so we can apply it to ourselves. Sort of like a how-to. How to stay in your lane in two parts. Part one, which we'll focus on first, is stay true to your calling. So let's see if we can learn that from here and have some takeaways for today. Chapter 18, verse 19, and here's what the writer said. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, "Let me run now and take the news to the king how the Lord has avenged him of his enemies." Okay, we're jumping in the middle of a story here, an event. So let me just kind of bring you up to speed. David is the chosen king over Israel. God chose him to do that. But his son Absalom didn't like that. He wanted to be king. And so he rebelled against his father and against God, obviously, because David was God's choice, and so Absalom, his son, rebelled against him. And on top of that, he convinced most of Israel to go with him. So what happened was there was a war, a battle between Israel, which would be Absalom's defectors, and David and his people. He had a couple thousand still following him. But God gave David's army victory over Absalom and all of his rebels. And Absalom was killed in the battle. So now is the aftermath. That's where we're at here in our scriptures. And the people that are there at the battlefield need to now go let David know what's happened with their victory and what's happened with Absalom, because David wasn't there to witness it. The people convinced him to stay back in the city where it was safe, and they would go fight for him. And so it seems like this guy, Ahimaaz, has been sort of an official runner in the past to bring the news of how the battles are going, right? And so he wants to go do that again. And he asks the general, Joab, if he can go to David and tell him. So look what happens in verse 20. It says, and Joab said to him, you shall not take the news this day, for you shall take the news another day. But today you shall take no news, because the king's son is dead. Okay, for some reason, Joab doesn't want him to do it. And we don't really know why. It doesn't say. You get an idea, and I'm going to share some of those as we go. It could be that it's because he doesn't know the whole story, that he wasn't right there watching it. It could be this is such a big deal because Absalom's dead. I don't want you to do this, right? So there's several reasons why this could be. Maybe you come up with one on your own. So David says no, and then look at verse 21. He says, Joab said no, and then he said to this other guy, Cushite, go and tell the king what you've seen. So the Cushite bowed himself to Joab and took off running. Okay, so you got what's happening, right? First guy, Ahimaaz, says, I want to go. I did it again. Joab says no. And he turns to this other guy and says, you go, and he takes off running. And then verse 22, Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said again to Joab, you might circle the word again there, but whatever happens, please let me also run after the Cushite. So Joab said, why will you run, my son, since you have no news ready? Okay, he's arguing now, isn't he? Joab already said what? No. You see, here's our first person who won't stay in their lane. And he said no. Yeah, I don't want you doing that. But he's arguing. I want to go. Now, some of this could be what's happened previously. Because Joab knows that the last two times that David got bad news like this about somebody close to him, he had the messenger put to death. Do you remember that? You've been along with us in this book so far. In chapter 1, Saul and Jonathan were killed, and the messenger came thinking he's going to get a reward, telling him about it, and David put the guy to death. Same thing with Ishbosheth, one of his sons in chapter 4. A similar thing happened. I teach from the New King James, and sometimes other versions explain a little bit more, so it's helpful if you read more than one version of the Bible when you're studying it on your own. The ESV explains something here where it says, this section, it tells us that Joab told him there was no reward. He wasn't going to get a reward for this news. And so perhaps that's what he was after, to get a reward from David for this news that he was going to share with them. So, in other words, Ahimaaz has a lot of ambition, right? But Joab could be protecting him here and sending the other guy instead. Because this guy's a priest's son, and maybe he's like, if the king gets mad and kills him, it's going to be really bad. So I'm going to send the Cushite. If he dies, it's okay. I'll just send him over there. No big deal. But he's still arguing. Verse 23 says, he's still talking. He says, but whatever happens, let me run. So he said to him, run. Then Ahimaaz ran by way of the plain and outran the Cushite. This reminds me of when people keep after God to give them something that he doesn't want to give them. And we can do that, God, can I have this? And you get a sense, no. But I really want, please, can I have this? Just keep begging, I believe that God has a perfect will for you, where you stay in your lane, and a permissive will, where you kind of crash into other things. And he'll let you have your permissive will. He'll let you do things if you reject his best for you. And I know because I've done things where I was like, yeah, I shouldn't have done that. I knew it, and I did it anyway. Because I have free will to make some of these calls in my life. And there's times in the Bible where this comes up, and it's kind of interesting. And a good example of it is King Hezekiah. If you remember him, King Hezekiah was really sick at one point, and Isaiah was sent by the Lord to say, look, you're not going to recover from this. You're going to die, so get your house in order. Well, the king didn't like that, and he began to cry out to God to give him more time on earth. And the Lord did. He gave him 15 more years. Now, what's interesting about those 15 years is that's when the worst king of Israel was born, his son Manasseh. And it's interesting because Hezekiah got what he wanted, but Israel was much worse off because of Manasseh. And so you could argue that Hezekiah should have just received God's will to get my house in order, and I'm going to die. Even though that would be hard to swallow, who's to say that Manasseh wouldn't, something like that wouldn't have happened to them. So I bring all that up because this guy is kind of like that. He just won't let up. And so Joab's like, all right, chief, just go. Go if you really want to go. If you feel like you have to, I'm not going to stop you. And he outruns the Cushite. He knows a shortcut or somewhere, takes the easier route. So the guy's got ambition, and he's got a lot of ability. Right? Okay, so now the scene shifts to where David is. Verse 24. He says he was sitting between the two gates. That's at the city, right? They would have walls around the cities, and then a gate where they'd have like a guardhouse, and that's the only way you could get in. And the watchman went up to the roof over the gate to the wall, lifted his eyes and looked, and there was a man running alone. Then the watchman cried out and told the king, and the king said, if he's alone, there's news in his mouth. And he came rapidly and drew near. Okay, so David is waiting there at the city gate for the news, and we're going to find out that the news that he's really interested in is about his son. He primarily wants to know about Absalom. And that's because he told his officers last time not to harm him in battle, right? Don't harm Absalom. Just go get victory, And so he sees the one guy running back. He's like, ooh, good news. Because if you see the whole army running back, that's bad news, right? One guy, okay, good news from a messenger. Then in the watchman, verse 26, saw another man running. And the watchman called to the gatekeeper and said, there's another man running alone. And the king said, he also brings news. So the watchman said, I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. And the king said, he's a good man and comes with good news. Okay, David knows him. He's like, yeah, he'll have some good news for me. He'll tell me Absalom's okay. You know, we're doing well in the battle and those kind of things. Okay, so to summarize, we've got two messengers coming, and they're going to have two different messages. So, in verse 28, Ahimaaz called out and said to the king, all is well. Then he bowed down with his face to the earth before the king and said, blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hands against my lord the king. All is well. You know, that word there is in the original language, it's shalom, right? Peace be with you, that kind of thing. But he's been running, so it's probably like, all is well, you know, kind of a thing. He just got there, and he tells them that there's been this victory. So he obviously knows some of what happened, that there's victory, but he says, all's good. It's all good. But actually, it's not. It's not all good. And you know, just as a little side note before we go on, lots of people are saying that today in our culture. All's well. But it isn't all well. I mean, just look at the statistics. This country, this world is in trouble in a big way because of sin in the world. And it's a mess. Now, there's a lot of good stuff happening. I'm a pretty hopeful guy because of Jesus. But all is not well. And yet that's what a lot of people say and what they think. So he's like, it's all good. It's all good. You got victory. Well, the king in verse 29 said, is the young man Absalom safe? And Ahimaaz answered, when Joab sent the king's servants and me, your servant, I saw a great tumult, but I did not know what it was about. And the king said, turn aside and stand here. So he turned aside and stood still. Okay, he doesn't know, right? He's like, I'm not really sure. I saw a bunch of people. Something was up. But what did David really want to know about? He wanted to know about Absalom, right? And Ahimaaz says he doesn't know anything about that. Well, there was a big hubbub, but I don't know what happened. Now, here's the thing about this. It's kind of weird. He did know. I don't think what he's saying here to David is completely true. It's only part of the message. Because if you go back to verse 20, Joab told him that Absalom was dead, right? I mean, we all read it with our own eyes. So he's not telling him the whole thing. Okay, so Ahimaaz is a good runner, but he's not a good messenger. And that's probably why Joab didn't send him. You know, he's the kind of messenger that only wants to deliver positive news. And how many are doing that today? You know, like if somebody only wants to talk about the positive things when it comes to the things of God. I'm in one of the house-to-house groups here, just like many of you are. And this week, when in our house-to-house group, we talked about this subject, just how some people overemphasize one characteristic of God. You know, like they'll say, God is love, God is love, God is love. And God is love. It's true, isn't it? The Bible says he is. But it's also true that God is just, and God is holy, and God is perfect. And so you got to be careful overemphasizing any one thing about God. And there's parallels to what's happening in our text here with things that are happening today in our society, in the churches. And People bringing the message of God today, but only part of it. I would call them, instead of messengers, I'd call them editors. I'm not supposed to edit it. You know, some people get into the ministry or, get an audience on, YouTube or whatever, just because they have an axe to grind. Or they want to distort the scriptures to make themselves feel better about it or something. And that's wrong. And so because of that, they won't say hard things like God is a just judge and those sort of things. It really bugs me when people invoke the name of Jesus, but it's a different message. And so I'm thinking that Joab knew this would happen the whole time. He's like, that kid, he won't hurt David's feelings. He won't say the right things. He just wants to bring the news that they won, remember, for the reward. So he's got a lot of ambition and a lot of ability, but not much to say. And so David says, all right, you just stand over there. So to wrap up part one here of our two-parter today is be careful of avoiding being true to your call. Right? We should be true to whatever we're called to do. If you're a Sunday school teacher, just be true to that. Minister to those kids in grace and truth. If you're a wife or a mom out in the business world here, be true. Let God use you and work through that. Stay in your lane. Well, part two of how to stay in your lane, I call this part, keep your priorities straight. So it's different, and we'll look at David and what he does and his response here and see if we can learn something from him. So verse 31 and 32 says, just then the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, there is good news, my lord the king, for the Lord has avenged you this day of all those who rose against you. He already knows that, right? And the king said to the Cushite, is the young man Absalom safe? So the Cushite answered, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise against you to do harm be like that young man. Okay, well, that's another way of saying he's dead, right? And I think that he did this right because he tells him the truth. He's direct, but he says it in a, sort of a respectful manner, I think, in the way that he can. Now, I think that he thinks that David's going to be glad to get this news because they won. They have victory. The person who is causing them so much problems is gone. But clearly, David is more interested in Absalom than in the outcome of the battle. You know what, you guys? That's really his only concern here. And to me, he should have cared about the nation of Israel, because he's the king, than only his traitor son. But he doesn't. And the king, verse 33, you can tell, is deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said thus, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. All this anguish over his son. And it's because he loves him, right? He's a rebel who David loves anyway. He even wishes he could take his place. If only I died in your place. But of course he can't. You know, the amazing thing about this is the great love that he has for his son, even though his son was a complete mess. But parents do this all the time, right? They love their kids unconditionally, even though they're a mess. David could have hated him for what he did. It was awful, the things that Absalom did, but he doesn't hate him. Now, I think Pastor Bill mentioned this when he taught a big section about Absalom a couple of weeks ago, that we are, in a sense, like Absalom, because the Bible tells us that we've all gone astray. That Paul the Apostle said in Romans 3 that there's none good, no, not one. We all have fallen short of the glory of God. And that's because of our sin nature that we inherited from our parents and their parents and their parents and their parents all the way back to the beginning. I inherit the sin nature, and then the things that I do proves that I'm a sinner because I break God's moral law. And so there's none good, no, not one. And if you think about it that way, God could have hated us too, because we're a mess. But the Bible tells us differently. It tells us plainly that God so loved the world that he gave his son for us. Jesus did what David couldn't do. He died in our place. That's grace, you guys. That's grace. One example of it, a big example of grace, that the Lord died in our place. Sandy Adams, one of the pastor teachers that's on our radio station, said, he calls it love without a catch. And I love the way that that's described. No strings attached from God. I just want to do something because I love you. Love without a catch. And that's what God gives away to people. Now, it's possible that David is really worried about Absalom's eternal future, and that's why he's so upset here. Because it doesn't look like Absalom knew the Lord, and that would be frightening to David. That would be frightening to any father who knows God. And so he's, in the moment, would rather be in his son's place and take his penalty upon himself. You see, David wanted to do something like that, but God actually did. Isn't that amazing? And I would just talk to you for a moment here today if you are not a Christian yet. Because God did this as much for you as anyone else on earth, because he loves you. That's why he sent his son Jesus to die a miserable death on a Roman cross and to take the sins of the whole world upon him, and the anguish from that, for being separated from the Father for that time, to just feel the torture and the pain of the sin of all the world, all the horrible, creepy things that people have done down through the ages. Jesus took it upon himself. And he wants you to know that if you will put your trust in him, you will be forgiven of anything that you've ever done to offend God. It's the best news ever. That's why it's called the gospel, the good news. Because he doesn't want anybody to perish, especially you. And so this was a valid offer 2,000 years ago, and it's a valid offer today. And I would urge you to receive it yourself today. And we're going to pray for you at the end of our service and ask that you would receive Christ for yourself. Well, that's chapter 18, closing out. And I'm just going to go up to verse 8 in chapter 19 as we finish this part 2 of keeping our priorities straight, staying in our lane. So look at verses 1 and 2 with me, would you? It says, "And Joab was told, 'Behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom.' So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people. For the people heard it said that day, 'The king is grieved for his son.'" Okay, so normally this would be a big celebration day, right? They just had a war victory. But not now. The king's upset about his son. And they can hear it, right? Crying out, "Absalom, Absalom." They're walking past the gate and they hear all this. So my contention here is that David has his priorities mixed up. He so desperately wants Absalom to be alive and unharmed that he's oblivious to everyone else and their needs. Because remember, this is very important, David is a believer and he's a father who cares for his son, but he's also the king. And he's responsible for justice in Israel and protecting the people. He's got a big job here, and he has to do it all. And he's not doing a very good job at it right now. So what do they do? What do the people do? Look at verse 3. It says, and they stole back into the city that day as people who are ashamed steal away when they flee in battle. You see what's happening? He's making them feel ashamed about what happened, like almost like they lost. Feel bad about it. They risked their life for him. They stayed with him, even though Absalom and the rest of Israel was against them. They stayed with David, fought for him, believed that he was called by God. And now this, and they have to kind of slink back in. But the king in verse 4 covered his face, and the king cried out with a loud voice, "Oh, my son Absalom! Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." He's really distraught, isn't he? And can you blame him? It's his son. I can't even imagine what that feels like. However, the Apostle Paul instructed us or warns us to beware of being in sorrow like those who have no hope. Sometimes people can just get so consumed with sorrow that they look like somebody who doesn't even know the Lord because they just have no hope in God and what this means and what God can do through it. David is making a mistake that many make, and that's letting their feelings rule them. And so I think that in this case, David should have stayed in his lane as king. And it's not that he can't mourn the death of his son. He should. But he also has another responsibility here, and his priorities are not good and making everybody feel bad. So fortunately, David has somebody who knows him that's going to fix this problem. Let's look at verses 5 and 6. It says, then Joab came into the house to the king and said, today you have disgraced all your servants who today have saved your life, the lives of your sons and daughters, the lives of your wives and the lives of your concubines, in that you love your enemies and hate your friends. For you have declared today that you regard neither princes nor servants. For today I perceive that if Absalom had lived and all of us had died today, then it would have pleased you well. Wow, that's quite a rebuke, isn't it? And he makes a lot of sense. You see, David's focus was negatively affecting a huge amount of people, and it was causing all this confusion there. And so Joab's like, what do you think would have happened to us if Absalom won? He'd have killed us all. Your family, you and me, everybody. Is that what you want, for him to live and all the rest of us to die? Your priorities are all jacked up, man. But put yourself in David's shoes for a moment. I was thinking that he's likely blaming himself for what's happened in the past and has a lot of guilt over it. Because, you go back to the earlier chapters of this book, and he started the downward spiral of his ministry by sinning with somebody else's wife, Bathsheba. And it started this whole chain of events of dysfunction and sin in his family. The Lord told him that he did that. And Even though David was forgiven by God, we saw previously, there's still all these consequences that are happening. And he's no doubt has all these, this remorse over his own failure as a father, and feels partly responsible for what's going on. I can just imagine him sitting there crying, thinking, oh, I should have discipled him better. Why didn't I discipline my son? Because it doesn't look like that's the kind of guy he was. Now, I think he can let God remove that for him. I think he can accept his failure as nothing that he can do to change it now and press on, because that's what God tells us to do in the scriptures. You see, this is so important because our past mistakes can sometimes paralyze us into being an ineffective believer. And we're just stuck in something and stunts our growth as a Christian. And I've seen it a lot. And sometimes it's just for a period, and sometimes it's for a whole lifetime. And I know because I've got my own failures. And if we just keep on that, if that's our focus, our priorities are messed up. We can start to believe that we are our failures instead of who we are in Christ. And that's a real temptation. Yes, it's true that scars remain from things in the past, but let me ask you this. Whoever said that we are going to live spot-free lives? Nobody ever said that. I'm a fallen man in a fallen world. I am not going to live a spot-free life. I'm going to do my best, try and follow Jesus with my whole life, but I'm going to make mistakes, and so will you. He made some big ones, but I think it's so important that we know, like he should know, that when God forgives, he forgives completely, and embrace that. And that should be like the banner that we carry. Who I am in Christ. Now, I think Joab is actually kind of awesome here, because you know what he's doing is he's acting in the best interest for everyone. David's just acting in the best interest for David. He's saying, look, what I want you to do is the best for David's sake, for the people's sake, and for God's kingdom's sake. Joab wanted to end the war. He wanted the victory to be celebrated. And so he says, look, David, your excessive mourning is selfish. This is not all about you, man. And you're making it all about you. Those loyal supporters of yours, they need to enjoy the victory. And you're making them feel terrible. So snap out of it. Stay in your lane. Be the king. It's good counsel from him. Well, he continues. He's not done yet. Verse 7 says, therefore, arise, go out and speak comfort to your servants. For I swear by the Lord, if you do not go out, not one will stay with you this night. And that will be worse for you than all the evil that has befallen you from your youth until now. Wow. So he's got a decision to make, right? He's like, you think it's bad now? Just don't do anything about it. It'll get way worse. Get over yourself. Go encourage the team. This is a great leadership principle, by the way. Those of you who are leaders of something, a family, a ministry, a work group, sometimes we just need to get over ourselves and go encourage the team. That phrase, speak comfort there in verse 7, the Hebrew, the literal is speak to the heart. Speak to the heart. That's what David was supposed to do. Speak from your heart, David, and tell them how much you appreciate their sacrifice. That was the best thing for him to do in that moment. Nobody's saying David can't mourn his son, but he's got to get his priorities straight here. And, Joab is a guy who clearly has issues, but he's got his priorities straight. And you know what? I think that everybody would be wise to have a Joab in their life. Somebody who will just tell it like it is. And I hope you have someone like that. Maybe it's your wife or your dad or a ministry partner. I have a friend who calls this, he says, someone to speak into your life. I think it's really important. Do you have that? Do you have someone to speak truth into your life? Who speaks into yours? Someone to help you stay in your lane. I Googled the title of this message today, and was looking for images online, and I saw this T-shirt here. We should get those for all of us. Stay in your lane, bro. You need somebody when you're struggling with stuff to give you that T-shirt. Say, look, make sure you're keeping your priorities straight here. I think the message is that David should have been more concerned about what's best for everyone, not just himself. And that's what the Bible teaches too, that we should esteem others greater than ourselves, that we love our neighbors as ourselves. And what I mean with this and him, and then I'll finish. If we're bummed out and discouraged and depressed, it often affects everyone around us. And the human condition, I think, really likes that. It's part of our sin nature. I mean, there's part of us that needs comfort from other people, and that's good. So when things aren't going well, you don't have to hide it. You shouldn't. But sometimes I think that people feel much better about their depression and their discouragement, and they're just bummed out if everybody knows it. And that's not good. And that's how I feel like what he's doing. And so God help me if I can't make a decision to let God encourage me when things are going bad. We should all be able to do that. And I pray that's who we would be. Nobody's saying you can't mourn for lost ones. No one's saying that it's wrong to be upset about things. But we got to keep our priorities straight too. And not, take this to the place where it becomes a sin. Well, at this time, I'd like to invite the worship team back up as we finish our time in God's Word today. And they'll bless us with a song. So let's read verse 8, and then we'll close, okay? It says, "Then the king arose and sat in the gate. And they told all the people, saying, 'There's the king sitting in the gate.' So all the people came before the king, for every one of Israel had fled to his tent." So good for David. He made the right choice. All right, he decided, I'm going to go encourage the people and show my appreciation that their sacrifice was worth it. Now, do you think that he felt like doing that in the moment? No, Mike's saying no right there. I don't think he felt like doing it right then. But, a lot of life is doing things we don't feel like doing. Believers are supposed to have God's desires in mind. And others have needs too. And this is just a really good kind of time where we can consider how we respond to things as they come up in life. So I hope this encouraged you today to stay in your lane. You got something out of this that, if we look at the example of the first guy, Ahimaaz, remember, I think that guy should have stayed true to his calling, right? And that's what we're supposed to do. Stay true to our calling, just be true to it. A little thing that God gives me to do, a little thing that he gives you to do. And then David, I believe, should have kept his priorities straight, And who knows what God can do if you keep your priorities straight. Well, let's stand and pray or close with this song, and then I'll have Andy close us in prayer. And I just pray you guys would be blessed the rest of your week, that God's word would minister to you and his grace would show you so much love and power and encouragement that you would accomplish what he has set forth in your life to do. So God bless you and be blessed this week.